It's the week ending Saturday the 9th of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Chancellor cutting national insurance by 2p in the pound, Republican candidate Nikki Haley stepping down, paving the way for a Trump-Biden rerun, and Dave Rowntree, the drummer from Blur, being selected as Labour's candidate for Mid-Sussex. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Julia O'Driscoll and Harriet Marsden, and we welcome back science and climate journalist Jessica Hullinger. We're recording on World Book Day today. Who have you all come as?
Moby Dick.
Now you mention it, it's obvious.
Harriet the Spy, is that a book?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Jess, did you dispatch any children to nursery or preschool today wearing,
Yeah, my youngest went as Zog.
Right.
And then my eldest, his is tomorrow, actually, for reasons I won't get into, but he's going as Peter Rabbit.
Oh.
Right, okay. Homemade or shop bought, or a mix of the two?
No, shop bought, 100%. I don't have time.
Okay.
I appreciate people who do, but I don't.
I did cobble together a talk from the Phantom Toll booth, but then I thought, because it's an American book, I'm going to have to send him with the book, because the teacher, who was dressed as Mr. Bump, just won't know.
Yeah.
What is Mr. Bump?
Who's Mr. Bump? Only one of the most important figures in all of children's literature. We'll come to that another day. Jessica, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The hunt for planet-warming methane really heats up.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ignition. And liftoff, Falcon 9. Go SpaceX, go Transporter 10.
Vehicle is pitching downrange.
Doubling. MOD chamber pressures.
SpaceX live streaming a rocket launch this week. Jess, what was the rocket, and why is this your story of the week?
Yeah, so this is a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket that is taking a number of things up into orbit. But among the things in its payload were a new satellite launched to track methane. And it was created by a U.S. nonprofit called the Environmental Defense Fund. And it's going up to keep an eye in the sky on what's happening with our methane emissions, and hopefully can help us understand where emissions are coming from and who is responsible for them.
Okay. I mean, Julia, were you aware that methane is a problem in terms of climate change? It's not really at the top of most people's understanding of that.
No, I think most people more often think about carbon dioxide, which is obviously the biggest greenhouse gas, but methane is the second. And actually, I think when I've thought about it before, it's more been in conversations of like, what do we do about agriculture? And I think on this podcast, we discussed New Zealand trying to curb like the way that cows farm.
Burp,
there you go. So I was kind of aware of it, but looking into just how significant a problem methane poses to the climate for this story, I was really surprised by some of the information, particularly that even though it contributes less than carbon dioxide, it contributes far more in terms of warming. So in the first 20 years that methane is in the atmosphere, it captures more than 80 times the amount of heat than carbon dioxide. So it warms the world much more rapidly. And of the 1.1 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures that's occurred since pre-industrial era, a third of that is due to methane. So it is a really significant contributor that just isn't being talked about as much.
But this is far from a novelty, Harriet. A satellite that can monitor methane levels. There are others.
Oh yeah, no, there are. But the really interesting thing about this one, I love that it's like the size of a washing machine. I don't know if anyone else was picturing a really massive satellite, but it's really small. But it's incredibly powerful. It's got these amazing sensors that can measure methane leaks much more accurately than other ones. And they can also detect how leaks are changing over time, because it's got this incredible resolution of like 140 meters. So it's really effective at spotting really small leaks that make really big problems, like Julia was explaining. like Julia, I wasn't cognizant of how dangerous methane actually is. And I just saw one quote in the Financial Times, the president of the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, it's a bit of a mouthful, he said to imagine that fossil fuel emissions put the world on a slow boil. Methane is the blowtorch that is cooking us all. Methane leaks from Turkmenistan's two main fossil fuel fields caused more global heating in 2022 than the entire carbon emissions of the UK. So I think that really shows just how mind-boggling the effect actually is and how small a place it can come from.
Wow. Okay, so Jess, this is going to highlight where methane is coming from, but so what? I mean, what do we do with that information?
Yeah, so I think the idea is that this satellite will help us understand what the big emitters are. So it's going to, in the first year, it's going to be able to take a look at something like 80% of the world's oil and gas infrastructure. So a lot of methane emissions that are produced by human activity come from oil and gas production. And so a lot of these companies don't monitor their methane emissions or have leaky infrastructure. And so the idea is that this satellite will be able to spot the big ones. And another thing that makes this project different is that it's partnering with Google, and Google will use some AI to basically sort through all the data and put it all online. So it's all going to be public. And so researchers, policymakers, and the companies themselves, the emitters themselves, and the whole industry can see where the emissions are coming from. And I think the idea is to sort of try to hold them accountable and generally raise awareness. You know, you can't change something that you can't monitor. You can't reduce emissions if we don't know where they're coming from. So there's a sort of naming and shaming element here. Now, that's not to say that it'll work. I mean, the companies won't have to respond, but I think that the more light that is shown on this, the more they will sort of be under pressure to respond.
Yeah, it could be awkward if one of the companies is Google that's emitting methane.
Yeah, that would be awkward.
But I mean, assuming it is an oil and gas company, is there the money there for them to make reparations? I mean, don't get me wrong, they're hugely profitable businesses, obviously, but it costs a lot to have that kind of infrastructure. How easy is it to repair a methane leak that's visible from satellites?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't know exactly the answer, but I would guess that considering how much oil and gas companies are bringing in every year, there might be some money left over. But I also think that there have to be incentives from the government as well. There has to be some funding to say, like, listen, we're going to release money for this. And I actually think there is some from the Biden administration that has said, we will help you to update your infrastructure. I think that's going to be necessary. If we're going to expect them to make these changes, then we have to incentivize them financially.
Julia?
I read as well that it's potentially going to be profitable for these companies. It's in their interest to capture methane because it's the biggest ingredient in terms of natural gas. And so if they're able to capture it, then potentially they can sell it on again as more gas. So,
yeah, but hold on, selling it on and using it in industry still emits it, though.
But it's not leaking into the atmosphere, though, I think is the point. And it did also say that it's these leaks are relatively cheap to fix. They're cheap and they're easy and they're quick to fix if you know where they are.
Yeah, well, so methane, it's the main ingredient in natural gas, right, which is burned to heat homes. It's the stuff that comes out of your stove when you're heating your food, and it's in theory much cleaner to burn, but it is still not great for the environment. But it's used in industry it can be sold as a fuel, basically.
Julia, are you convinced that this satellite is sufficiently different, as Harriet was suggesting, from the other ones that are up there? Because, you know, if the aim of monitoring the environment is to improve it, surely endless satellites littering the Earth's orbit are also an environmental problem.
Yeah, I know space junk is something else that we've talked about before, and it is a massive problem. And obviously I'm in no way a satellite expert, but I would say that I know, shock horror to anyone who's ever heard me talk about space on this podcast. But I think reading about it and also just reading the enthusiasm with which like the journalists in this area who are much more expert and the scientists that they're speaking to, the way that they're talking about it did make me feel that actually this does feel like something that is very different. And basically it's the fact that this satellite can do two things at once. It can pick up incredibly small concentrations of methane. I read that it's 3 parts per billion, which is much, much smaller than many other satellites. But then it can also do this incredible scan of 125 miles by 125 mile radius. So it's almost got lots of other satellites before can do one or other, and this one I was almost imagining a bit like a microscope, like you could do both in terms of identifying an area and then really figuring out what's going on, which does sound like it could be much more useful.
And Harriet, what can the rest of us do about this? I mean, can we monitor our methane emissions?
Yeah, so this is where it gets really, really interesting, because there's so many different sources of methane. So it's all sorts of different issues. Like one massive biological source is wetlands and warming wetland areas, particularly in East Africa and the tropics. But another one, a really, really big one that's human caused, is landfill. And also any of the methane emissions that are naturally produced, like by wetlands or permafrost melting in the Arctic, or even, agricultural, like raising cattle and stuff, they are all exacerbated by the climate crisis. So obviously the best thing that people can do is to do whatever they can to mitigate the climate crisis. But I just want to talk about the methane bomb for a second, because I found this absolutely fascinating, and I think that everybody should know about this methane bomb.
Please, you can't just drop terminology like that into the conversation and not explain it.
It's very scary, but also very interesting. So go with me on this one.
Different to a stink bomb.
Yes. So it looked like it was leveling off atmospheric methane. It really looked like it was plateauing. But about 15 years ago, researchers saw this kind of dramatic uptick, and they thought that was due to fossil fuel production, because, methane is a natural gas, but it's also produced, as we said, by landfills and paddies and cattle. But then a couple of years ago, this uptick massively accelerated, and nobody was really sure why. And one of the theories is that the increase isn't coming from the fossil fuels, it's coming from the Earth itself. The theory is that the Earth itself is producing more methane, and it's like this horrible catch-22, that the warmer the Earth becomes, the more methane it produces, therefore the more warm it becomes. And
we're trapped in a death spiral that leads to our extinction.
We're trapped in a death spiral that scientists are calling the methane bomb. Yeah, I did say it was quite scary.
It's often the case, isn't it, Jess, with these environmental stories, actually. There's always a theory that says, whatever we do, this will accelerate and get worse and perpetuate. How seriously is that theory taken in your circles?
Oh, very seriously. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, I think, a lot of the warming that we already have right now is unfortunately locked in, right? But I want to talk about a little bit about why that is and why methane is so important. So carbon dioxide, as Julia mentioned, it sticks around in the atmosphere for like hundreds of years, right? So even if we were to turn off all of our carbon emissions tomorrow, the warming effect of those would be felt for years to come, which is why there's so much focus now on things that we are going to have to do to remove that carbon dioxide from the air if we are going to try to avoid the worst effects of climate change in the long term, right? We're trying to solve that problem now. That's a long-term problem, and it's underway. However, what makes methane so important right now in terms of reining in temperatures in the short term is that because it breaks down so quickly in the atmosphere, it breaks down in about a decade, right? So like if we were to turn off all the methane emissions tomorrow, we would feel the effects of that for about a decade, but then they would go away, which makes it such an important short-term solution, which is why they're talking about why we have to fix this problem now.
And do you think this satellite is the answer, or would you prefer to see something more drastic?
It's not the only answer, of course not. But as I said earlier, I think that you can't fix something if you don't know what the scope of the problem. I think that because human-made methane emissions are such a large source of total methane emissions, we should do everything that we can to try and rein them in. I also think, there are other efforts being made across the board, like in terms of agriculture. I mean, agriculture is even a greater source of methane emissions than oil and gas, which is interesting, but there are efforts being made there. For example, there's a company named, I think it's called Bovaer, that is producing a feed additive that you can give to livestock that would reduce the methane emissions that come from their burps, which is huge. So there are innovations in this field that are happening all over the place. And I think because it's seen as sort of like low-hanging fruit, it's being taken really seriously. So, I know that there's some questions like, why do we need another methane satellite if there are so many already in existence? But I think the more the merrier. The more effort we can throw towards this, the likelier our chances of avoiding the worst of it in the short term.
And just finally on this, Julia mentioned that one of the ways we encounter the conversation around methane is frequently through vegans telling us to eat less meat and dairy because of the cow burp situation. If this satellite can demonstrate that a large proportion of methane is coming from industry unrelated to meat, does that let us carnivores off the hook?
No, no, I don't think so. I mean, as I said, agriculture is still a huge, huge emitter of methane. So no, I'm afraid not.
Even if it comes out as 10%, still don't eat so many burgers.
One of the biggest things that you can do to reduce your climate footprint is to reduce your consumption of meat. It just is. And even though that, we shouldn't focus on individual actions and we should try and go for the big guys, the oil and gas companies and the biggest emitters, like if you want to do something on an individual level, cut back your flying and reduce your meat consumption. That's just it.
Sobering news. Let's go to a break. Harriet, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why is the public hooked on dead whales?
Listen, there are hundreds of people that have been flocking here over the course of the day to see this humpback whale that washed up on shore sometime early this morning. Now, I spoke with staff from the Virginia Aquarium and Marine Center. They said that the juvenile whale washed up sometime this morning and folks noticed it around 10:30. That's when crews got to work. Now, aquarium staff tell me that the whale is a male and it's anywhere from 4 to 7 years old. Now, observers were shocked when they saw the whale being pulled to shore after being found floating in the surf.
It's the first time I've ever seen something like that, so once in a lifetime, so I'm going to spend a bit out here to see what happens. So, love whales.
13 News Now Virginia reporting on a humpback whale that washed up on their oceanfront on Monday. Harriet, why do you want to regale us with the tale of a whale?
Well, as we heard, this dead humpback whale washed up on the beach in Virginia. And actually, there was another one that was found floating just off the coast of the same beach the following day. And this is a really strange coincidence because the Financial Times in the UK, the Financial Times magazine over the weekend published this incredibly long and incredibly beautiful piece about why encountering beached and dead whales profoundly changes so many people and how it can devastate a community. But how, as we saw in Virginia, it can also fascinate people. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people turned up to watch the stranding response team pull the whale up the beach, perform the necropsy to find out why it died. So this article in the FT by Miles Ellingham, it began because of the mass stranding of a whole pod of 55 pilot whales that happened on the Isle of Lewis last July, which was Britain's worst mass stranding for at least 70 years. But it's perhaps not such a coincidence because whale strandings are massively on the rise and no one's really sure why.
Okay, let's just talk about the human side of that for a second, Julia. What is the impact that having a whale beaching on your beach can do to you as a community?
I mean, it's massive. Just thinking about like the operational practicalities that go into like dealing with this kind of situation. I guess also it depends on what situation the whale is in, if it's still alive and there's a potential that it can be refloated, or whether it's dead and decomposing on the beach. And I was reading this FT piece, which really was quite astounding. It had some really quite horrible imagery and descriptions of just kind of rotting carcasses. And because there is this level of fascination around it, some people are, I mean, you shouldn't touch a whale carcass that's rotting. They're full of disease and it
can explode, can't it? I know from my various journeys around the internet.
Yeah, exactly. But people do kind of want a piece of this story and this unusual event. People feel like they want a piece, and so there are also reports of people kind of hacking bits away. And as someone, so I'm from Norfolk, and we have an amazing seal colony of thousands and thousands of seals that come up onto the beaches in winter every year. And having seen, I mean, you see everything there. You got pups being born, but then you also have a lot of seals who obviously die and don't survive. And even just thinking like the practicalities around dealing with a seal when you're then talking about an animal like a whale, where it's just so much bigger, it's just quite an incredible feat.
And actually, in a weird coincidence, Jess, you've written this week for Fast Company an article about humpback whales and the fixation on those, but also actually, as you might expect, an article in Fast Company, the technology that's being developed around people's fixation with whales.
Yeah, this is a really interesting study that came out, I think, last week, in which researchers have been using AI to analyze the tails, so the humpback whale tails that they send up into the air just as they're about to dive. And if you take a picture of those, every tail is unique. And so researchers have been crowdsourcing pictures of these tails from scientists, but also people who are just out on like whale watching trips. And they've been collecting them on this website called Happy Whale, which is very delightful. And then they've been running it through like an image recognition tool powered by AI to identify the whales and give them a number, assign them a number, and then see where they are. Like if they pop up, track their location.
My wife's like that with yachts. You can write the name of any yacht into Wikipedia. You're like, oh, that was owned by this billionaire and then it was sold to that one.
Yeah.
If she knew you could do that with whales as well, that would be every holiday.
Well, what's interesting about this is the data goes back like 20 years. And recently this study was published showing that the findings are quite stark. They've shown that 7,000 whales in the North Pacific, humpback whales, died between 2012 and 21. 7,000 whales died. And that was about like 20% of the population. The reason for this that they pinpointed was a massive ocean heat wave that came between 2014 and 2016. And it killed off a load of the food that was available for the whales. It altered the ecosystem significantly, and it reduced the ocean's ability to support these whales. And that's really sad. But one thing to mention is that the humpback whales, particularly in the North Pacific, but everywhere, have had a huge population rebound in recent years after commercial whaling regulations came in. They were almost hunted to death, basically. And then I think in 1982, the commercial whaling laws came in that dramatically cut down on the whaling. And since then, the population has rebounded massively. And so the number of humpback whales that are dying is really sad, but the population remaining is still much, much higher than it was when whaling was not under control. And I think also this points to a sort of a different take on these whale deaths, which is that they could actually be indicative of a population in rebound, right? So like the more whales you see beaching, it could suggest that like there are just more whales in general, and so when they are beaching, there are more of them. But it could also suggest that there are just so many that when there is a change in the ocean ecosystem, that they just can't sustain it, because there are so many of them. So it's an interesting way to think about it.
Or could it be, Harriet, that it's to do with technology and people and the fact that we're all linked together through social media? So when there's a whale beaching in a relatively rural or obscure area, it's all over the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point. Like as Jess's really brilliant article really went into, is this improved technology can allow us to have a better understanding of communities and pods of whales and their numbers, and much more accurately track, like you say, with social media, with whale strandings. It's not necessarily that strandings are becoming more common, but possibly due to populations rebounding or improved reporting techniques. But there is also, like the methane story, there is also a massive human element here, and we can't skip over it. I mean, before the Isle of Lewis stranding last summer, the previous largest stranding was in 2011, when there was a pod of 70 whales and 20 of them died, and a government report blamed 4 massive underwater bombs. So that they damaged the whales' hearing and navigation skills. So things like sonar, any noise underwater, it means that the whales can't figure out where they are. They're coming in too close to the shore. Strandings are almost always associated with some form of disturbance. So like a predator or an earthquake, or they come in too close to the shore. And that is a lot. It's also related to climate change as well, and the warming of the water changing their migration patterns. So it's a much bigger picture.
Okay, but why should we really care about this? We've explained why people relate to the whales, and we've explained why there are lots of different theories as to the cause of it. But still, if you're talking about a few hundred deaths, lots of species get through that in a day. So why is this your story of the week?
Well, we're not exactly talking about deaths. What we're talking about is deaths of a marine animal that are happening on the shore in human territory. And that is profoundly disturbing to a lot of communities. Like Julia was explaining, there's a big impact to tourism. I mean, in the Isle of Lewis, for example, one local told the paper it looked like a war zone. We're talking about 50 dead whales scattered along the length of the beach. Big impact on tourism. Psychologically, it's very disturbing, because these whales, generally speaking, the very big ones in particular, earlier. Logistically, you can't really put them down. It's very difficult to put them down with a lethal injection or a shotgun. So a lot of the time you have to sort of watch them die, and they're panicking and they're beating their tails on the ground, and it can be incredibly traumatic. But also, as Julian mentioned, the disease, the devastation to the tourism industry, like you mentioned, that time in 1970 when a sperm whale, to try and get rid of this massive 45-foot long dead sperm whale in Oregon, they blew up the carcass, and then there's just raining whale bits like falling down from the sky. I mean, it's terrifying, and I think there's
they do explode naturally as well. I should let you know.
I think
they did
also,
once try and detonate one. That is a fun fact.
The FT, I think, made a good point that people really see their own struggles in like these strandings and these terrifying, these whole communities that follow one beached whale. They see these strong social bonds and they see the grief and panic.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it, Julia? The fact that people relate to these creatures because they're so different from us, actually. You know, I mean, the fact that they obviously might be influenced by sonar in the first place or dark sunspots puts them in a very different kind of hormonal place to most of us. And yet, people do relate. And particularly this thing of when you do manage to put the whale back in the ocean, sometimes it beaches itself again, like it wants to die.
Yeah, there's a few different elements that I think are really interesting about that. And one, I think, is there is so much that is unknown about these animals and about the changes to their behavior and why this is happening. And so there's that sense of like unknowability that is obviously intriguing, but also I think I adore being by the sea. I just think like it is always a place that you just remember your own like size in the universe compared to everything else that's going on, and it kind of like puts things in perspective in a way that I think then when an event like this happens that is just so kind of incredible and kind of brings people together, but there might not be a happy outcome for it, but it does kind of bring people together and remind them of their own mortality as well. So I think it's those levels of the unknown perspective, but then also like community around something that is just so out of the ordinary for so many of us on our daily lives.
And actually, again, to speak to your last story, Jess, you know, and what we can see from space in terms of our emissions, there's so much in the ocean, isn't there, that we simply, even from space, cannot see and don't understand. And actually, I don't know, AR tagging a whale seems kind of cool, but it's really very primitive in terms of understanding what's underneath us.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in the beginning stages of this. And I think, to your point, you know, the ocean is still one of the least explored places on Earth, right? And we don't know everything about it, and we're always finding new species there. So there's a lot of mystery. But I think, you know, technology can really help us to understand what's happening in the ocean. And I think there are some really weird, wacky things coming out. Like there's this one project that involves using AI to help humans talk to whales, which has gotten like huge amounts of funding, like 33 million in funding, which is bonkers. But, you know, I think humans do relate to whales for a lot of reasons. I think, you know, while they are obviously very different from us, they're also very easy to anthropomorphize. They're quite smart. They're mammals. They're beautiful. A lot of people, you know, who are millennials were raised at a time when like Save the Whales was a huge campaign. And so, you know,
Free Willy is responsible for a lot of attitudes, I'm sure.
Not technically a whale, though.
Is an orca not a whale? I should have paid more attention at SeaWorld.
It's a cetacean. Yeah, not quite, no.
Okay.
Yeah, well, anyway, I think that we will continue to learn more about these creatures, and I think that like talking to whales is weird and interesting, but I think we do. I mean, what would they say? You know, like, do we want to know what whales say? I'm not sure that I do. Let's just leave them be and try and figure out how to be nicer to them.
Harriet, I think it's unlikely that a whale will beach in Crouch End, but if it did, would you be down there rubbernecking?
No, I don't think I would, no, because I think that although whales are incredibly fascinating, and I'm particularly fascinated by all whales and cetaceans, and as Jess was explaining, these incredibly strong social bonds and our tendency to anthropomorphize the most intelligent animal species. But I think that there's something incredibly unsettling about seeing a whale beach and strand and die that kind of agonizing, very, very disturbing death. And I just want to end with a quote from the piece, which I think really sums up what Julia was saying really nicely. So as humans, we see our own biological pathos in strandings. How many times hundreds of millions of years ago did those early vertebrate terrestrials try and fail to colonize the land, not having developed the requisite appendages and lungs? When whales strand, they remind us of our own fragility and unlikely origin.
You're listening to Thought for the Day on The Week Unwrapped. Julia, you're up next after this. Okay, Julia, you are finishing us off this week. What do you think the week should be remembered for?
Is it last orders at Soho House?
In fact, I have a large network of movers and shakers who work at the intersection of art and technology at the best agencies. Like my friend Tara. She did the lighting design for Pharrell's Louis Vuitton show. Like, how sick is that? I take care of myself. I exercise. I play tennis. And people respond well to the geometrically aesthetic way I display those tennis courts to my stories. But yeah, sorry to make it weird. Whatever.
Instagrammer Brian Park's video, Every Overheard Conversation at Soho House, reposted by the Instagram account Soho House Memes on Wednesday. Julia, why are we talking about Soho House, and why has this story got to the stage where there is an Instagram account called Soho House Memes?
So we are talking about Soho House because the company was expected to release its full year financial results on Wednesday, but it announced that day that it's been pushed back until next week. And there's been speculation swirling in this week and in previous weeks about what's really going on behind the scenes at Soho House, following a report in February that alleged that the company's financial situation is pretty dire. It said that Soho House is facing an existential crisis that is eerily similar to WeWork. And Soho House has strongly refuted this and said that the report contains factual inaccuracies, analytical errors, false and misleading statements. So obviously people are looking to see what the results are going to say, but it also comes at a time where I think, you know, as we were saying about the meme account, that Soho House is kind of becoming a parody of itself and everything it stands for. And so I think it's going to be a really interesting moment to see how people respond.
Okay, I mean, what is Soho House and what does it stand for, actually? Because I think, you know, some people listening to this, I assume everyone listening to this has heard of Soho House as a private members club, but probably a large proportion of listeners think of it as the original Soho House in Soho, a building that you're a member of. It's not that at all anymore, is it? It is analogous to WeWork.
Yeah, massively. So the company has expanded so much. It was founded 29 years ago, and it's expanded so much. So now there are 42 houses all over the world, Mexico, Istanbul, all over. And there are about 200,000 members as well. And so people are saying that now what started as a single house in Soho that was also kind of seen as a haven for kind of creative industry and talent in London has become this kind of sign of, well, faux exclusivity, I guess, now that is accessible all over the world, and that also can now be accessed by so many people. There was a change in kind of the ethos of, a few years ago to what a former CEO said. Now you just had to have a creative soul rather than work in the creative industries to be able to be a member.
But in that sense, Jess, there's no mystery to any losses that they're making because the company has never turned a profit. That's a matter of public record, isn't it? The reason it hasn't is because it's been investing in all these extra houses. I mean, like lots of startups, I mean, okay, it is very old now, but like lots of startups, it's a case of they're using the capital to expand into other territories. That's all perfectly explicable, not that unusual.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right. I mean, it hasn't turned a profit in 29 years, but I think what the sort of the catalyst for all these concerns comes from a Wall Street short seller called Glass House that has highlighted Soho House as being a short sell. So they're betting that it's gonna have some trouble, and it's saying that they have a poor accounting measures, massive debt, and they called it troublesome that since going public they have not shared their member retention rate on a quarterly basis, when this is common for other company presentations. And I mean, the thing that we need to mention is that Soho House went public in 2021. It's not privately held anymore. So once it did that, it kind of put itself in a position where it had to keep growing and growing and growing and growing. Once you go public, you can't just sit idly by. You have to turn profits for your investors. So, I think the point here is that the underlying message is that Soho House is not being honest about its finances or its business model, and therefore it is in trouble and should be cast as such.
And also, I guess, Harriet, whether there is just a fundamental tension there between the pressure to grow every year and the reality that the less exclusive the clubs are, the less appealing they are to the people they want to be members.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is a story that, yes, it's a business story. And yes, it's a story about a business that has never turned a profit, but expanded massively into 42 locations around the world. But this is a much more cultural story, I think, about something that was set up to be only for people in the creative industries, and then desperately now trying to raise money from like banker investors, and now it's got 200,000 members. I mean, it's the antithesis of exclusivity, and it's completely goes against what the original purpose of a creative haven was meant to be. And yes, Soho House never turned a profit, which is bad business, but it was incredibly iconic, and it did become kind of this go-to party spot for very, very, very successful entertainers and pop stars. So I think it's just really sad, because it's a classic startup business story, but it's also a classic story of like how money corrupts, and it creates things that were trying to be creative. It's now just an operation of profit. And also, let's just like mention for a second the fact that in a cost of living crisis, generally people who work in creative industries aren't spunking their salaries on an exclusive membership to something that has 200,000 members. I mean, that's just ridiculous.
Well, I suppose the problems that it appears to be reporting as well, Julia, sort of looking into the memes, is that for people who can afford it, and maybe they aren't creatives, as Harriet suggests, because those people wouldn't have the money anyway. Maybe they are the people that they expanded the membership to, accountants and solicitors and all the rest of it, people who work in advertising. But those people who end up in the clubs are saying, you know what, I can't get into a screening because they're all full. I can't get a table in the restaurant. I'm paying my £400 a month or whatever it is, and I can't get in.
Yeah, absolutely. And almost like I wouldn't be surprised if they announced that they were going to have like a more premium tier of membership where like now you wouldn't have to, book 2 weeks in advance if you wanted a table. It's really like the reports that people are saying that actually it's just not good value for money anymore. And I'm sure obviously there are a certain number of probably longer standing members where it is, and people whose businesses, especially if you're a freelancer in the creative industries where you're having a lot of meetings all over the world with different clients. And
yeah, I mean, I should declare an interest here, which is I'm not a member of Soho House, but I am the kind of person that people sometimes take to Soho House for a meeting.
Yeah, exactly.
I've been taken to Soho House many times, and I always thought it was completely overpriced and the food is terrible and it's just never a good atmosphere.
Okay. Well, I was going to say in its favour, as someone who gets taken for a meeting, I'd still take a meeting in Soho House rather than a Starbucks. I mean, it's a nice place to be taken. It hasn't lost its cultural cachet completely.
I guess, yeah, exactly. It does serve a purpose, but the fact is that now actually people are saying it's not serving that purpose anymore. It's not offering the value that it's promised to people. And so also I think people are looking at alternatives. There have been other clubs that have opened. The House of Cocoa in Camden has been one that's attracted a lot of genuine creatives since it opened a couple of years ago. And so people are they are looking for alternatives and value for money, which is probably a conversation that Soho House wasn't having to think about in its earlier days when it did have this reputation and was held up as this place to be seen and to go. But as that shifts and competitors come in, I think it's finding how it's going to continue to compete that's going to be so key.
I mean, it just seems, Jess, like the living embodiment of the Groucho Marx dictum. I don't want to belong to any club that will accept people like me as a member. I mean, it's just that, isn't it? Like, once it's become possible to be a member, it no longer feels like a place you want to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the issue, right? I mean, when it's the loss of exclusivity. I think the draw of it for so many people was that it was such a status symbol and made them sort of special that they could get in. And who cares if the service is bad? I'm one of the very few people who actually are in this club. Like, I'm paying for it to be bad, you know? Like, but now that everybody's in it, it's no longer an exclusive club. It's something that so many people are in. And I bristle at the whole, like, oh, we only accept creative souls. Like, what does that even mean? That's so empty and ridiculous. And if you want to find creative people, if you want to do creative things, you know, go to the pub with your friends, like, go to a museum, go for a walk in the woods. Like, it's such a ridiculous facade for what it obviously is, which is like a status symbol, really. I mean, it's ridiculous, I think. Sorry, I'm being...
Well, it's about being seen, isn't it, Harriet? And that's the other thing. You know, if you've ever been to any of their roof terraces, which have become something that they've rolled out across the world now, I don't know, I suppose they're based on kind of a Miami-style beach club thing. But, you know, swimming in a pool in a Soho House isn't about exercise. It's about everyone looking at you as they munch on their enchiladas.
Yeah, I mean, the loss of exclusivity is extraordinary. I think that is partially tied to the rise of social media and how I don't need to go to any Soho House locations because I can see what everyone's doing there and I don't really fancy it. It kind of, the veil has been lifted and the mystery is gone. But I think there's a bigger point. It's not just Soho House, it's anything. I mean, Soho House was, as Julia said, set up nearly 30 years ago. And anything that's cool, anything that has a cultural cache, that is by definition time limited, right? So nothing that is like, now it's 30 years old. So yeah, I mean, a young creative of 25 could go if they can afford it and they can get a membership, fine. But does a young 25-year-old really want to be somewhere where their parents might have been or people their parents' age might still be hanging out? I mean, something that is new and that is innovative is cool. Something that is nearly 30 years old is just not cool anymore.
So, Julia, final word to you. Do you think that Soho House can turn this around? I mean, if you were a shareholder in Soho House, would you be worried?
Yeah, I think I definitely would. I think it's just going to depend whether it's too little, too late, really, given that, I mean, maybe we've known how this was going to end for a long time, given they have never turned a profit. But equally, who knows, maybe they've got some new tricks and offers up their sleeves that might turn it around.
OK, off for a round of small bites in the club bar then. We can have prawn and crab bites, calamari fritti or the padron peppers. Who's having what?
Padron.
Padron peppers.
Guys, the prawns.
One of each we'll share
For
with
someone,
a perfect set for Soho House.
Who loves ocean life, you're going straight for prawns.
I told you I love it. I love it in all ways.
Maybe just not whilst looking out the beach. My thanks to Julia, Harriet and Jessica. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription at theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.